But is such work as you have talked about really criticism? It is the highest criticism, for it criticizes not merely the individual work of art, but beauty itself, and fills with wonder a form which the artist may have left void, or not understood, or understood incompletely. The highest criticism, then, is more creative than creation, and the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not. That is your theory, I believe? Yes, that is my theory. To the critic, the work of art is simply a suggestion for a new work of his own. That need not necessarily bear any obvious resemblance to the thing it criticizes. The one characteristic of a beautiful form is that one can put into it whatever one wishes, and see in it whatever one chooses to see. And the beauty that gives creation to its universal and aesthetic element makes the critic creator in his turn, and whispers of 1,000 different things which were not present in the mind of him who carved the statue, or painted the panel, or graved the gem. It is sometimes said by those who understand neither the nature of the highest criticism nor the charm of the highest art, that the pictures that the critic loves most to write about are those that belong to the anecdotage of painting, and that deal with scenes taken out of literature or history. But this is not so. Indeed, pictures of this kind are far too intelligible. As a class, they rank with illustrations, and even considered from this point of view are failures, as they do not stir the imagination, but set definite bounds to it. For the domain of the painter is, as I suggested before, widely different from that of the poet. To the latter belongs life in its full and absolute entirety, not merely the beauty that men look at, but the beauty that men listen to also, not merely the momentary grace of form or the transient gladness of color, but the whole sphere of feeling, the perfect cycle of thought. The painter is so far limited that it is only through the mask of the body that he can show us the mystery of the soul. Only through conventional images that he can handle ideas. Only through its physical equivalence that he can deal with psychology. And how inadequately does he do it then, asking us to accept the torn turban of the Moor for the noble rage of Othello, or a dotard in a storm for the wild madness of Lear, yet it seems as if nothing could stop him. Most of our elderly English painters spend their wicked and wasted lives in preaching upon the domain of the poets, marring their motives by clumsy treatment, and striving to render by visible form or color the marvel of what is invisible, the splendor of what is not seen. Their pictures are, as a natural consequence, insufferably tedious. They have degraded the invisible arts into the obvious arts, and the one thing not worth looking at is the obvious. I do not say that poet and painter may not treat of the same subject. They have always done so, and will always do so. But while the poet can be pictorial or not as he chooses, the painter must be pictorial always. For a painter is limited, and not to what he sees in nature, but to what upon canvases may be seen. And so, my dear, earnest pictures of this kind will not really fascinate the critic. He will turn from them to such works as made him brood and dream and fancy, to works that possess the subtle quality of suggestion, and seem to tell one that even from them there is an escape into a wider world. It is sometimes said that the tragedy of an artist's life is that he cannot realize his ideal. But the tragedy that dogs the steps of most artists is that they realize their ideal too absolutely. For when the ideal is realized, it is robbed of its wonder and its mystery and becomes simply a new starting point for an ideal that is other than itself. This is the reason why music is the perfect type of art. Music can never reveal its ultimate secret. This also is the explanation of the value of limitations in art. The sculptor gladly surrenders imitative color, and the painter the actual dimensions of form, because by such renunciations they are able to avoid too definite a presentation of the real, which would be mere imitation, and too definite a realization of the ideal, which would be too purely intellectual. It is through its very incompleteness that art becomes complete in beauty, and so addresses itself not to the faculty of recognition, nor to the faculty of reason, but to the aesthetic sense alone, which, while accepting both reason and recognition as stages of apprehension, subordinates them both to a pure synthetic impression of the work of art as a whole, and, taking whatever alien emotional elements the work may possess, uses their very complexity as a means by which a richer unity may be added to the ultimate impression itself. You see, then, how it is that the aesthetic critic rejects these obvious modes of art that have but one message to deliver, and having delivered it become dumb and sterile, and seeks rather for such modes as suggest reverie and mood, and by their imaginative beauty make all interpretations true, and no interpretation final. Some resemblance, no doubt, the creative work of the critic will have to the work that has stirred him to creation, but it will be such resemblance as exists not between nature and the mirror that the painter of landscape or figure may be supposed to hold up to her, but between nature and the work of the decorative artist. Just as on the flowerless carpets of Persia, tulip and rose blossom indeed and are lovely to look on, though they are not reproduced in visible shape or line. Just as the pearl and purple of the seashell is echoed in the church of St. Mark at Venice. Just as the vaulted ceiling of the wondrous chapel at Ravenna is made gorgeous by the gold and green and sapphire of the peacock's tail, though the birds of Juno fly not across it. So the critic reproduces the work that he criticizes in a mode that is never imitative, and part of whose charm may really consist in the rejection of resemblance, and shows as in this way not merely the meaning but also the mystery of beauty, and by transforming each art into literature solves once for all the problem of art's unity. But I see it is time for supper. After we've discussed some Chambertin and a few ortolans, we will pass on to the question of the critic considered in the light of the interpreter. Ah, you admit, then, that the critic may be occasionally allowed to see the object as in itself it really is? I'm not quite sure. Perhaps I may admit it after supper. There is a subtle influence in supper. Part 2, with some remarks upon the importance of discussing everything. The ortolans were delightful and the Chambertin perfect. And now, let us return to the point at issue. Don't let us do that. Conversation should touch everything, but should concentrate itself on nothing. Let us talk about moral indignation, its cause and cure, a subject on which I think of writing, or about the survival of Thersites as shown by the English comic papers, or about any topic that may turn up. No, I want to discuss the critic and criticism. You have told me that the highest criticism deals with art, not as expressive, but as impressive purely, and is consequently both creative and independent, is in fact an art by itself, occupying the same relation to creative work and or that creative work does to the visible world of form and color, or the unseen world of passion and the thought. Well, now, tell me, will not the critic be sometimes a real interpreter? Yes, the critic will be an interpreter if he chooses. He can pass from his synthetic impression of the work of art as a whole to an analysis or exposition of the work itself. And in this lower sphere, as I hold it to be, there are many delightful things to be said and done. Yet his object will not always be to explain the work of art. He may seek rather to deepen its mystery, to raise round it and round its maker that mist of wonder which is dear to both gods and worshippers alike. Ordinary people are terribly at ease in Zion. They propose to walk arm in arm with the poets, and have a glib, ignorant way of saying, "Why should we read what is written about Shakespeare and Milton? We can read the plays and poems, that is enough." But an appreciation of Milton is, as the late rector of Lincoln remarked once, the reward of consummate scholarship. And he who desires to understand Shakespeare truly must understand the relations in which Shakespeare stood to the Renaissance and the Reformation, to the age of Elizabeth and the age of James. He must be familiar with the history of the struggle for supremacy between the old classical forms and the new spirit of romance, between the school of Sidney and Daniel and Johnson and the school of Marlowe and Marlowe's greater son. He must know the materials that were at Shakespeare's disposal and the method in which he used them, and the conditions of theatric presentation in the 16th and 17th century, their limitations and their opportunities for freedom, and the literary criticism of Shakespeare's day, its aims and modes and canons. He must study the English language in its progress, and blank or rhymed verse in its various developments. He must study the Greek drama, and the connection between the art of the creator of the Agamemnon and the art of the creator of Macbeth. In a word, he must be able to bind Elizabethan London to the Athens of Pericles, and to learn Shakespeare's true position in the history of European drama and the drama of the world. The critic certainly will be an interpreter, but he will not treat art as a riddling sphinx, whose shallow secret may be guessed and revealed by one whose feet are wounded, and who knows not his name. Rather, he will look upon art as a goddess, whose mystery it is his province to intensify, and whose majesty his privilege to make more marvelous in the eyes of men. And here, Ernest, this strange thing happens. The critic will indeed be an interpreter, but he will not be an interpreter in the sense of one who simply repeats in another form a message that has been put into his lips to say. For just as it is only by contact with the art of foreign nations that the art of a country gains that individual and separate life that we call nationality, so by curious inversion, it is only by intensifying his own personality that the critic can interpret the personality and work of others, and the more strongly this personality enters into the interpretation, the more real the interpretation becomes, the more satisfying, the more convincing, and the more true. I would have said that personality would have been a disturbing element. No, it is an element of revelation. If you wish to understand others, you must intensify your own individualism. What then is the result? I will tell you. And perhaps I can tell you best by a definite example. It seems to me that while the literary critic stands, of course, first, as having the wider range and larger vision and nobler material, each of the arts has a critic, as it were, assigned to it. The actor is a critic of the drama. He shows the poet's work under new conditions and by a method special to himself. He takes the written word, and action, gesture, and voice become the media of revelation. The singer or the player on lute and viol is the critic of music. The etcher of a picture robs the painting of its fair colors, but shows us, by the use of a new material, its true color quality, its tones and values, and the relations of its masses, and so is in his way a critic of it. For the critic is he who exhibits to us a work of art in a form different from that of the work itself, and the employment of a new material is a critical as well as creative element. Sculpture, too, has its critic, who may be either the carver of a gem, as he was in Greek days, or some painter like Mantegna, who sought to reproduce on canvas the beauty of plastic line and the symphonic dignity of processional bas-relief. And in the case of all these creative critics of art, it is evident that personality is an absolute essential for any real interpretation. When Rubinstein plays to us the Sonata Appassionata of Beethoven, he gives us not merely Beethoven but also himself, and so gives us Beethoven absolutely, Beethoven reinterpreted through a rich artistic nature and made vivid and wonderful to us by a new and intense personality. When a great actor plays Shakespeare, we have the same experience. His own individuality becomes a vital part of the interpretation. People sometimes say that actors give us their own Hamlets and not Shakespeare's, and this fallacy, for it is a fallacy, is, I regret to say, repeated by that charming and graceful writer who has lately deserted the turmoil of literature for the peace of the House of Commons. I mean the author of Obiter Dicta. In point of fact, there is no such thing as Shakespeare's Hamlet. If Hamlet has something of the definiteness of a work of art, he has also the obscurity that belongs to life. There are as many Hamlets as there are melancholies. As many Hamlets as there are melancholies? Yes. And as art springs from personality, so it is only to personality that it can be revealed. And from the meeting of two comes right interpretive criticism. The critic, then, considered as the interpreter, will give no less than he receives, and lend as much as he borrows. He will be always showing us the work of art in some new relation to our age. He will always be reminding us that great works of art are living things, are in fact the only things that live. So much indeed will he feel this, that I am certain that as civilization progresses and we become more highly organized, the elect spirits of each age, the critical and cultured spirits, will grow less and less interested in actual life, and will seek to gain their impressions almost entirely from what art has touched. For life is terribly deficient in form. Its catastrophes happen in the wrong way, and to the wrong people. There is a grotesque horror about its comedies, and its tragedies seem to culminate in farce. One is always wounded when one approaches it. Things last either too long or not long enough. Poor life, poor human life. Are you not even touched by the tears of the Roman poet? Tells us are part of its essence. Too quickly touched by them, I fear. For when one looks back upon the life that was so vivid in its emotional intensity, and filled with such fervent moments of ecstasy or of joy, it all seems to be a dream and an illusion. What are the unreal things but the passions that once burned like fire? What are the incredible things but the things that one has faithfully believed? What are the improbable things? The things that one has done oneself? No, Ernest. Life cheats us with shadows like a puppet master. We ask it for pleasure, it gives it to us with bitterness and disappointment in its train. We come across some noble grief that we think will lend the purple dignity of tragedy to our days, but it passes away from us and lets things less noble take its place, and on some gray windy dawn or odorous eve of silence and of silver, we find ourselves looking with callous wonder or dull heart of stone at the tress of gold-flecked hair that we had once so wildly worshipped and so madly kissed. Life, then, is a failure. From the artistic point of view, certainly. And the chief things that makes a life failure from this artistic point of view is the thing that lends to life its sordid security.